me as environmental health specialist. I do home inspections, I do restaurant inspections, building inspections, land use permits, that kind of stuff. One thing that I've noticed with land use permits that is potentially affected by climate change, as indicated with the Bad River flooding, is when we're approving a bridge being built and maybe we only have the funds for a bridge that can survive a 50-year flood or an 80-year flood. Well, if you have a 400-year flood, then how do you even plan for that? Do you save up the money? We have a road that's crumbling and kind of an old rickety bridge that needs to be replaced, and we only have $100,000 in funding. Do you replace it with a 50-year flood bridge, or do we wait another 5-10 years to replace that with a larger bridge that can survive a storm like Bad River had? So those kind of decisions are always hard because people are going down a bumpy road and they want it replaced right away. But cost versus risk, it's hard to determine what's actually worth it when you don't know what the weather will be like.
For future planning, because the program's going to grow. The Head Start program has been on the reservation for over 50 years now. So it's a long-standing program. It's got legs. So I see, the tribe sees the program as a value, therefore it's undoubtedly going to continue. So now it's like, okay, you're planning a new building, you're planning this. Well, health services has to be at the table because of these issues. Environmental has to be at the table because we're having changes to the existing environment around the school. We're seeing more invasive species, or it's getting warmer, so we have to be on the lookout for poison ivy. Loves these hotter summers, so we have to be on the lookout for some of that. Integrated pest management. The bees and wasps were active longer. So, how do we protect the kids without putting down the heavy pesticides and stuff? Do we also plan for those anaphylactic reactions? So, yeah, it's a health issue, but based around a building, with that particular cohort of kiddos. So.
The engineering profession, it is really oriented around regulations at state, municipal, and also at national levels. And those regulations, of course, are fairly slow to adapt to a changing environment. There are, of course, many competing interests involved in those sorts of regulations and whatnot. And so, fortunately, what we see particularly at more local levels is municipalities taking the matter into their own hands, right? So they can go above and beyond regulations if they choose to, and many are seeing the need to do that, right? And so, that can take very different forms depending on where you're looking, but essentially, saying, well, we don't know how bad climate change is going to be over the lifetime of a particular piece of infrastructure, or let's say network of infrastructures, but we can think about a range of possibilities and design our projects in a way to add flexibility. And so I think that's really exciting and is really the direction that we all need to be moving with climate change adaptation as it pertains to infrastructure. Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District, MMSD, is actually one of the most progressive utilities in the country when it comes to climate change adaptation, and including setting out in their, they call it Vision 2035, this goal to essentially be ready for what the future brings in terms of flooding issues and wastewater treatment issues associated with that. And so they have built quite a bit of infrastructure, both really large-scale infrastructure. They built a very large underground storage tunnel that can be managed so that when a storm event comes and rainwater is coming into this tunnel from different locations, they can decide how much of that to release at any particular time, and basically they have quite a bit of capacity to control how floods play out downstream using this tunnel. Now they're also combining that with more decentralized sort of projects, so what they would call green infrastructure, right? So trying to reverse these trends of, you know, paving over everything in the city and reducing the ability of rainwater to infiltrate. So, you know, you can implement measures sometimes as simple as rain barrels, right? So to collect rainfall that comes off of buildings and through rain gutters and preventing it from, you know, running down the street and into our sewer systems. And then somewhat larger scale measures like permeable pavements, so that instead of water just running off, it's actually soaking in into the pavement and reaching the groundwater below. First of all, preserve what wetlands do remain upstream, and second of all, restore, enhance some of the ones that have been degraded over time through urbanization, right? And those are some of the most important measures that authorities can take when it comes to managing flood risks. And you know, floods have two issues that engineers historically have tried to wrestle with. One is the quantity of water, right? And so water quantity is what ends up damaging buildings and other sorts of property, right? The other is water quality, right? So heavy rainfall will cause, you know, runoff to carry agricultural waste, yard waste, motor oil, anything that you have out there that's harmful to health, and will carry it, you know, essentially downstream, and you know, that can affect whoever's living downstream. So wetlands serve useful benefits, useful roles for both of those issues, right? So they can store floodwater, basically slow down the rate at which that flood is moving downstream, and then at the same time can actually filter out some of those harmful contaminants. And so they're really important. They serve a really important role when it comes to flood management, and increasingly engineers in collaboration with ecologists and others are turning towards wetlands, or let's say back towards wetlands, to help manage floods. I, in a former lifetime, worked at the World Bank and spent a fair bit of time down in the Caribbean in these very small islands, also with fairly limited, you know, countries with fairly limited resources, and for them, these road crossings were a huge issue, you know, hurricane rainfall and whatnot, and so they were having exactly the same discussions of basically rebuilding bridges with more clearance underneath them, and either oversizing culverts compared with what they do now, or replacing them with some more substantial structures, right? So a lot of that is really taking traditional civil engineering designs and civil engineering structures and just making them a bit bigger, right? Which is a good option in that it's relatively simple to do. It obviously costs a little bit more money, but you know, an interesting story here is when the United Kingdom, the engineering community in the United Kingdom decided that they needed to plan a little bit more for climate change in the wake of some very serious flooding there over the past decade or so. Engineering groups got together with climate scientists and sifted through a lot of data and a lot of studies, and ultimately what they arrived on as their adaptation strategy was just to design everything for, whether it's a bridge or a culvert or a levee or something, design it 15% larger. And so how did they get there? Well, you know, there was a whole range of possible outcomes in terms of extreme rainfall and flood impacts, but 15% was kind of in the middle of that and seemed, on the one hand, both credible in terms of the climate science, and on the other hand, at least as importantly, very simple to implement, right? 15%. We've seen that infrastructure can be very cost effective when it comes to managing flood risks. The problem is that, as I mentioned, it takes a long time for those payoffs to become evident in many cases. And that just presents a challenge for municipal authorities and politicians in particular that have, relatively short planning horizons. Mm-hmm. And so we need to find ways of helping municipalities and planners do that sort of long-term planning that we know pays off, but we know only pays off in the longer term. Municipal authorities, and I've already mentioned the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District as an excellent example of this, they know that that these issues that they're facing now are only going to be magnifying in the future, and ultimately they're responsible for keeping their citizens safe and providing those fundamental services. And so those sorts of authorities, both in Milwaukee and other parts of the country, are starting to step in and do that sort of long-term planning that's necessary, that politicians aren't necessarily supporting, but that the public want and need. Impacting individual pieces of infrastructure, such as a bridge or a roadway, to impacting networks. So those networks could be infrastructure networks like a system of roads, telecommunications, power lines, which, interruption of those networks obviously is going to have impacts on public safety, access to basic services like water, and somebody is knocking at my door.
Oh, really? Okay,
That's okay.
pause
We
button.
can. Oh,
okay.
whoops.
We're shooting a video. So yeah, you're fine.
Sorry about that. Yeah. We can start that one over. If you
Okay.
want. Yeah. Where was I?
So, risk management and infrastructure networks.
Yeah. So we're seeing a trend now in risk assessment, which is moving from away from thinking about risk just as affecting individual pieces of infrastructure, like a bridge or a section of road, towards risks, hazards such as floods affecting networks of infrastructure. So that could be road networks, water and wastewater networks, power supply, telecommunication. And obviously interruption of those networks is going to influence public safety, public health, and the ability of first responders, for example, to reach an affected area or even know what's going on in an affected area, right? And so this is a new sort of enterprise, and it's really one that needs to be done in collaboration with local authorities and even the public locally to understand, the particulars of these different networks. What are the vital road links? What are the vital communication links? And what's going to happen if one or all of those end up getting interrupted in the case of a major disaster? And that, requires sitting down with maybe some big maps and basically coming up with some scenarios and thinking through what those impacts might be, and then how you would respond accordingly, both during and immediately after a disaster, and then also in the long run to come up with some sort of solution to make sure that's not going to happen going forward. We really need to rethink the way that we build both our buildings and then the urban environments or suburban environments that those buildings make up, in order to reduce our reliance on air conditioning, or at least have backup plans in place to keep people safe during those sorts of events. And of course, the elderly are at the most risk for these sorts of issues. And so targeting those sorts of the elderly population is going to be really important when it comes to managing heat waves. Green building techniques help to address these sorts of issues of heat waves and reducing reliance on air conditioning. So basically using more natural methods to regulate a building's temperature. Combined with those green building techniques are actually much older technologies that have been used by indigenous peoples for centuries, right? So adobe, for example, is an incredible heat regulator. And so now there's actually increased interest in turning back to or adapting some of these, let's say, ancient technologies, ancient building styles, and using them in modern buildings to make these buildings more energy efficient and more resilient in the face of disasters.
In Oneida, I think that's why also our clients are more susceptible. I lived in a housing unit, and it's awesome that they created, these housing units and everything, but literally they just gave me 2 trees. So my house was like a boiling point. It literally was super hot. I couldn't grow anything. My grass was straw. So, and I knew the entire neighborhood was like that because we were just given a house on a plain lot. And so to me, it goes back to environment. Like, are we prepared? That's what I said. So actually my dad came over and he planted like 20 cedars and pines in the back. I ended up moving, and they're really, really tall right now. And that was when he first moved into his home, that's the first thing he did. And it was to block the wind during the winter and then to shade during the summer. And I don't think our community is ready for that, or don't think about that, because we're half urban. Okay, so we have majority of my particular clients live in Green Bay. It's hot, they're in a stuffy apartment, and then maybe the other half might live in Oneida, but do they know that planting more trees and, for the warm and for the cold would be, benefits health-wise for everybody. So that's what I always think of right away too, is those extreme temperatures and how we can help and maybe prepare. I know it's simple to me. It's like, let's plant some more trees. But it made sense because that's exactly what I did when I determined the struggles. So climate change in general, it just poses, I guess, dangerous situations for my clients because of lack of resources.